The latest rides on the coaching carousel and the ripple effects from the first round losses. We got all that and more. I'm Jason Fitz, and it is time for Inside Coverage. Welcome to Inside Coverage, where we dive into the how and the why on all things NFL. I'm Jason Fitz, hanging out with Yahoo Sports senior NFL reporters Charles Robinson, Jori Epstein. We're going to get into everything. Jori's been covering the press conference for Jerod, Mayo. We'll get into all the coaching vacancies. We'll get into ranking some of the openings that are out there. Got a lot to get into in the show. But y'all, I want to start with the very basic, because we're used to coaching carousels. This year, I don't know if it's because of the names or because of the jobs that are open, but C-Rob, it just feels like this year's even more hectic than usual. Like the placement isn't hectic, but the fact that there are so many names, there's an urgency this year that I don't know that I always feel. Does it feel any different to you?
Well, I think the experience level that we're seeing, obviously, the availability of a Bill Belichick, the availability of functionally a Pete Carroll. If Pete Carroll were offered a job, I think he would consider, leaving his advisory post in Seattle for that. Obviously, Mike Vrabel being available, Jim Harbaugh being available. That to me, I think, is the twist, obviously, in this year's set of candidates. And then you have all the typical coordinator candidates. But even some of those are interesting. You look at Todd Monken and everything that he's been able to accomplish the last few years at the quarterback position. You look at Dan Quinn, a defensive coordinator who has had coaching experience. In terms of the totality of the class, you can pretty much get whatever you want this time if you're an NFL owner. If you want experience and someone to come in a short window, you got that. If you want a program builder, you've got that. If you want someone with youth who also has a long track record as a head coach, or a solid track record as a head coach, Mike Vrabel, you've got that. Jim Harbaugh, program builder, offensive mind, everything that he's shown from San Francisco through the Michigan experience, leading them to a national championship. And then, obviously, just being a leader. And then Bill Belichick, to me, is maybe the last, I would say the last CEO head coach that we might see for some time. The number of options on the table, I don't ever remember it being like this in history. Just as many Super Bowl winners and great offensive minds and coordinators and, defensive, offensive, up and down the age scale. It's all there for guys this time.
Yeah, I think when we look at why are there 8 jobs open already and potentially a couple more could come open, there's still some questions we don't have answered. And I think a big part of that is because, as we've talked about on this show, if you're going to replace your head coach, you want to make sure you have a better option. You don't want to get rid of who's in-house if you can't feel like you have a better option. And as C-Rob pointed out, the supply on the market is just insane. I mean, we see versions of this every few years when we have incredible quarterback classes for the draft, around the draft. And then you have franchises who might otherwise have kept their quarterback because they didn't have a great solution. And they're like, but if I can get that guy on that price point, then why am I keeping my current guy when I feel like I need to take that home run hit? And so I think that we see it. And I think what's fun is that the same way that C-Rob was describing how we have different types of head coaching opportunities or different types of head coach candidates available, there are also different opportunities available. And I know we'll get later in the show to the story that C-Rob and I are working on where we basically asked a bunch of people to rank the openings. But one thing that stood out to me, for a spoiler alert, is that someone asked me, well, are you talking about what's the best job for Bill Belichick or what's the best job for Ben Johnson? And made sure to put the difference. And it's so about compatibility is there are some opportunities that are great this year if you want to have longevity, if you want to have an owner who believes in you, and if you want to have that low expectation and ability to get there. And then there are other jobs that are better if you want to go beat Don Shula's record as quickly as possible and based on what you want in terms of control also. And so I think it's just this fascinating supply and demand market that is just so much fun for us to cover. Obviously, sorry for people who lost their jobs, but the opportunity for those who are out as free agents right now is just at a really good level.
It just sort of hits me as you guys talk, and I'll use this weird music analogy that, neither of you will necessarily love, but I'll go here for a second. Like when you form a boy band, if you're like a manager forming a boy band, there's a formula to it, right? Like there's a bad boy and there's a guy next door and there's the guy that's sort of in the background. Like you have all of these different styles and you have to have one of all of them in a boy band, right? Like every boy band has each of these. The difference to me this year is, to your point, C-Rob, it feels like if you were constructing a boy band, like every one of these has such a different angle to them. Like who Harbaugh is as a coach is so wildly different than who Ben Johnson's supposed to be as a coach. So like you have your flavor, but that makes it much more difficult to figure out what you should do, because usually when we're talking about second-time coaches, there's a big yeah, but on their resume. I think it's pretty difficult to make a compelling case against hiring somebody like Belichick, somebody like Harbaugh. So like when you have guys, somebody like Pete Carroll, when you have guys out there that have accomplished so much that you're shocked are on the open market, and now you're trying to figure out, do I take one of these guys that's out here proof of concept, or do I roll the dice with one of these guys that are supposed to be the new connective next generation thing? Like this is such a everybody has their own flavor ice cream, but like I just feel like this is one of those fork in the road moments that organizations going to look back 5 years from now and have to answer very serious questions, just like they do in the draft. Did they get it right? Because this is a hiring cycle that has absolute, what feels like home run hires available. How do you respect that, but also then respect what's right for your organization? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, and what's interesting too is there's a flip side to this, and Jori alluded to the story that we're working on and talking about ranking those jobs. I talked to one person who will be on a number of lists, right? And one of the things that he said was, it's not just are they finding the right candidate, but you as a candidate are, especially when there's 8 jobs, potentially 9 or 10, we'll see what happens. But if there's this many jobs open, you now are picking, right? Like there are some candidates out here that are going to have an opportunity to have more than one job offered to them. And so they then have to find what's the right ownership fit for me? What's the right roster fit for me? Do I want to wait and maybe sit out this cycle and go to next year and sort of, and like he said, look, I don't just look at what's available now. I also look at the other jobs that aren't open and go, well, I really like that job. It seems like it's a year away from being open. And I don't like what's on the table in front of me right now. So I'm going to go ahead and stay where I am. I'm happy. I'm in a good situation. I'm connected to a really good roster right now. So let me just stay here. And almost like I think Ben Johnson a year ago had an opportunity, and I think he stayed when I think he could have gone to Carolina a year ago if he really had pursued it hard. And instead, I think he was like, hey, I'm in a good spot here. I'm happy with Detroit. Let me wait and be patient and see what happens in the next rotation. So it's not just, who are these owners picking? It's also who are the candidates picking as well. There's some optics that we don't often look at, where there are going to be some people who can have more than one job in this cycle, I think, especially given the level of talent and resume some of them are bringing to the table.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of that is Adam Peters, who came from San Francisco and is now the top football executive in Washington. And I couldn't tell you exactly who has offered him or hasn't offered him in the past, but I could tell you he's had a lot of interest for a lot of years and been widely viewed a top GM list for a long time. And someone told me today, they're like, look, if you're a head coach, it's attractive to go to Washington, and even more attractive than it was a few weeks ago, because they got Adam Peters, both because you feel like your cap will be in a better situation, and also because if Adam Peters, who had opportunities previously, it seems, and did not take them, willing to stay put in San Francisco, believes in Washington enough to go there, then there's something they're building there. And so when you talk about the confidence in an organization that these candidates will have, whether it's a GM or head coach, whichever one you're hiring first, the second one is going to consider how you went about the first opportunity.
You guys have sort of opened my eyes and blown my mind to something I learned years ago talking to a scout for an NFL team that I was friends with at the time. And he talked about how when you start prepping for the draft, you look at quarterbacks in 3-year increments, right? So you may not be aggressive, and fans hate this, but you may not be aggressive because you're like, hey, I got a better guy coming out next year. Never occurred to me that coaches are doing the same with jobs, and that's eye-opening. I'm going to flip our rundown as we're doing this live because I want to get straight to the best and worst head coaching vacancies, because we're here. We're talking about it as we speak. You guys are working on this for Yahoo, obviously. But when you look across it, I'll just cue you up with this. I cannot imagine having a student film calling Leonardo DiCaprio and being like, hey, man, I need you to come in and audition for it. That's what it feels like happens if Atlanta is actually interviewing Bill Belichick. Like, is Atlanta interviewing Belichick, or is Belichick interviewing C-Rob? To your point, is he interviewing Atlanta?
I enjoyed the release. that they had concluded their interview with Bill Belichick. Yeah, it's 100% Bill Belichick interviewing Atlanta. Of course, it goes both ways, but he is certainly the rare candidate where he is going through your laundry as much as you're going through his. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I think this piece that we're working on, I don't want to give away the list, but let's talk about Carolina, because I think we're going to be safe in every. Jori can tell me we have not yet revealed sort of what we've gotten from the people we've talked to, but it feels to me solidly that Carolina is the least. It's the least coveted job, I would say. As one person put it to me, he called it miserable. now we will bleep that out, of course. But the one thing about Carolina that I think is interesting, and when I was talking to this individual, they said you should always approach it owner first. He said, I hear the media and they're like talking about the cap situation, they're talking about the roster, they're talking about the quarterback. That's all great, and that's fine. Those are things that you look at. But he said, you go in through the front door straight into the ownership office. He's like, that's the first place you go. And if that's not right, I don't care what else is on that roster. He's like, Tom Brady could be on the roster. He's like, Patrick Mahomes could be on the roster. If you have a terrible owner, if you have a big problem with that owner, if you don't have a trust, a bond, that you feel like you can build of trust with that owner, it's not going to work. And you will be undermined in that job at some point. And so I think the optics of how David Tepper has gone through a couple GMs now, he's gone through a couple coaches now. The things, obviously, the whole drink incident with the Jaguars fans, it's a really bad look. And even some of the business dealings that he's had, obviously the South Carolina practice facility that he pulled the plug on. He looks like someone that does not have a great deal of patience. He's got a ton of money and assets and all these different things. But if you're not going to have a patient owner, that's going to sink you to the bottom of the list pretty quickly. And I think that's the problem Carolina is going to have when it comes to really top tier candidates. Even if David Tepper says, hey, look, I've learned some things. I'm going to completely take a back seat here and step back. I don't know that people necessarily would even believe that.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating. So I will give a little spoiler in that while Carolina definitely is going to be our collective bottom, and two of the coaches I talked to did rank as the bottom, I had one person put Tennessee as the bottom. And they said that just when you look at what the decisions the owner has been making, particularly that if Mike Vrabel is not good enough a coach for you, then who is? And look at the decision. It's an ascending decision while Titans are a descending team. Look at the talent of the other teams in the decision. And yeah, you might have Levis, but do you have the working organization or the working relationship you need between GM and head coach and owner, and where is the owner going to side between the two? And again, that's not a knock on a front office. That is how the owner is viewing them. And I had one person tell me they believe that ownership is run a little bit more like a fan. But what I think is interesting is that obviously the owner is the head coach's boss, unless there's an intermediary in between with like a GM, depending where you are. But I didn't realize quite how much that can impact them. So like, for example, someone told me today, think about it. Head coach is down there on the field, things are going wrong. Well, GM's up there in the team owner's suite and they're talking about it and just railing on them. Well, who is the owner then going to feel like they have the trust with? The GM who's able to have the conversations with things are going, or the coach? Someone's like, imagine if we flipped it and while the GM is selecting picks, a coach is in the room being like, that guy, we picked that guy, and kind of undermining it. You have the idea of, okay, what division are you in and how much patience do you have relative to the division? What are the expectations? But then also this idea of, how much is the owner going to give you the resources you need? And obviously, that like some owners are considered cheaper than others in the league, and most of them have pretty much earned that title. I don't think it's been given out unfairly to the few that it has, but that it hasn't just been something that trickles down to the travel or the facilities. It's, hey, can you get the staff you want? Can you keep the staff you want? Can you give the staff the type of contracts? And it's interesting. And again, this is something I would speculate, but I feel like it's educated guess. When you look at the Carolina staff this past year, I think one of the challenges to that staff is they had so many great minds in the same room. And what direction do you have? I think one factor, not the only, but one factor why you could get all those great minds is because of what David Tepper is willing to pay them and the type of contracts he's willing to give you to build out your staff. And so on one hand, that can be an advantage if you use it right. But it is interesting that there are teams where it's like, I don't know, will the Chargers let you build out your staff in the same way? On the other hand, they've got this new training facility. They're in LA. So some people I talk to are not as concerned about the Chargers being a cheap organization, so to say, as people think.
So here's where it gets interesting to me, because I'll put my fan hat on for a second. And one thing I constantly yell at fans about is this concept of, force insert owner name here to sell the team, which isn't real. And I can't scream this loud enough. Like, if Dan Snyder wasn't forced to sell for being as terrible as he was, it took everything to get Dan Snyder out. So just being bad at your job of hiring people and owning a football team is not going to get you fired, right? Like, the NFL is not just going to kick an owner out for going through a period of being terrible. So what, as fans, you have to accept at some point is, like, if your favorite restaurant suddenly sucks, eventually you just got to stop going to your favorite restaurant. Easier said than done from a fan standpoint. But when you talk about ownership, look at some of the jobs that are available, and I could question fatal flaws in ownership for the Titans, for the Chargers, who are notoriously cheap, for the Raiders, who haven't gotten it right and been dysfunctional for a generation, for the Seahawks, where Pete Carroll made it clear that new ownership comes out and doesn't necessarily have football on their mind, right? Like, Philadelphia may have an opening because their owners meddle. Like, I'm looking across the board at these openings and saying, man, ownership is an issue, is a bigger issue to failure of a team than most of us want to acknowledge in conversation.
I think it takes a combination of what is the owner's aim, in owning that team. Is it just to make money? Are their financial decisions ultimately done to keep as much capital as possible in their pockets at the end of the season? Or are they running the team the way that they ran their other business? That's another thing too, is that you have these owners who go, well, I was in real estate, and this is how real estate functions. So now I'm going to take that and I'm going to move it over to this team I now own, and I'm going to treat it like a real estate venture. It's not the same. You have to learn the business. You have to understand the business is different than the one that you had so much success in. And, so you have someone saying, hey, I made a gut decision based on this CFO that I hired, and it's not going to be a one-to-one on what your gut is for a football team, probably because your gut is not in tune with what you need as an owner and running a football team. I think the Detroit Lions, interestingly, are a interesting example. This is a team I covered, right, when I broke into the league. And that was an ownership group that was very, very hands-off when I covered it, but it was like in a bad way. Like, it was like there are things going on in the building with decision makers where you're like, there needs to be an adult above the other adults here to step in and say, there's just certain aspects of how the structure ran. Like, it was just, it was not well managed from an owner who completely disconnected. So as much as we're like, are they making bad decisions in terms of their hiring and firing? Are they meddling too much? Do they lack patience? There's also the absentee owner who's like, all right, well, I'm just going to go ahead and give it over and then let it do what it does. And after decades of not having success running it that way, maybe you should change, or maybe someone else in the family should take over the Detroit Lions. Like that to me was the big thing. Like, Bill Ford Sr., then it was Bill Ford Jr. And you're like, okay, this is like a lot of the same stuff's going on here. And it's a lot of the, same failures keep happening over and over again. And then, it goes to Sheila Hampford, right? All of a sudden you see a whole different mix of how the front office is run. And you see a whole the diversity of thought, the diversity of experience. Like, to me, I was like, man, it seems like a mess in there. And then all of a sudden it worked. And I'm like, but they did it completely differently than it had been done for decades before by Bill Ford Sr. and Bill Ford Jr.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting, the role of ownership. And when you think about it, most of these owners are able to buy these teams because they've had a lot of success, and they have had success in industries where a lot of people have had success, where a lot of people can have success simultaneously. And so it's not this zero-sum game where every single year 96.8% of teams in the NFL fall short of what their goal was. I would say end the year on a loss, but I guess technically if you just don't make the playoffs and you win in the regular season finale, you didn't end the year on the loss. But like, your chance of winning in the NFL is so different than winning in the other business that allowed you to buy it. And so I think that they sort of have these unrealistic expectations, and they try and, like Rob said, superimpose their beliefs from their other business onto the NFL, some of which might work if it's how do people work well together. But the NFL is an ecosystem that's different than the other industries, the same way I would say those industries are different from other industries that aren't them. In terms of someone selling the team or having to sell the team because even they threw a drink on the fan, which I am very much not endorsing, and I believe that is a problem. I don't even know that every owner who would want to sell the team could sell the team. Like, that's how hard it is to sell the team. When you saw, like, they needed Dan Snyder out of there for a lot of reasons, and it was still really hard to sell the team because teams are very expensive. They require a lot of approval. You have to get the person approved. You have to get the financial deals approved. We saw with the Josh Harris group, it's like, well, how many limited partners do you have? I mean, like, the number of obstacles to buying an NFL team beyond the immense amount of wealth you need, which is also already, it takes most of the world out of there. I mean, it's really, really hard. So I don't think teams should get their hopes up for owners selling. And the last thing I do want to say, and you can stop me if we're going to be talking about this, is the Eagles are a really interesting example in terms of the role of ownership in a team's success, because I was going to say I was in Tampa, and then I remembered I never got out of Tampa. So I'm in Tampa. Hopefully I'm getting out tonight. I've only had one delay on my flight as opposed to last night's 12 delays. But what I'll say is I was so surprised being in the Philadelphia locker room after the loss on Monday night. I don't know my days or my cities. On Monday night in Tampa, I was in the Philadelphia locker room. And again, I'm coming from someone who had been in the Cowboys locker room for 7 years regularly, dipped my toes in a couple other ones. And so I'm used to, like, in the Cowboys locker room, you expect your head coach to be there. Like, Jason Garrett was a mediocre to good coach who got to last 10 years. Mike McCarthy, now when he's coming out, Dak Prescott's like, hey, you want him out? Well, then take me too. My job should be at stake as much as his because he's a big part of my success. And then I go to Philly and I'm asking guys, like, who have been there for a while, I'm like, hey, outside noise is often different from the inside noise. What do you want people to know about Nick, and what do you expect to happen with his future? And I'm not saying no one stood up for Nick Sirianni, but I would say, first of all, the quarterback certainly didn't. When he was asked about if he wanted Nick to stay, which he could have answered very simply, he said, I didn't know he was going anywhere. To which people asked Jalen Hurts, do you have confidence in Nick Sirianni's ability to turn it around? Because remember, they now lost 6 of their final 7 games. And Jalen Hurts said, I have confidence in everyone in the building. We just need to play better. So he was not willing to expressly give vote of confidence to the head coach, which is pretty damning for your franchise quarterback who just got a mega deal this past offseason. And then even around the locker room, when I was asking guys, instead of just saying, like, yeah, of course we want our head coach, they're like, oh, that's above my pay grade. I trust whatever Howie's going to do. Howie will work his magic. Howie being the general manager, Howie Roseman. And so this is like the impact of ownership and general manager on even how the players view the coach. Forget how the coach can last. That's something. I mean, in Philly, there's institutional knowledge, as we've talked about on this podcast, of a coach being let go after having success. And so you really think about that when you consider what the role of your owner is in your ability to succeed.
So you guys are working on an article. It'll be out Thursday on the best and worst head coaching vacancies. Let me ask you this, because I don't want to give away the whole article. We want people to go check it out. When you did the article, did you include Philadelphia and or Dallas as openings in your consideration, C-Rob?
No, I mean, until they're openings, I'm not going to give myself extra work.
I love that. Is the most
I'm the opposite. I had everyone rank the teams. Then I said, if Philly or Dallas open, where would they be? And so I guess I can say that because it sounds like we're not including it. I had one person, I need to check the exact, but I know I had one person who said they would be at the very top. And they that person put Philly above Dallas, saying that while both rosters are really talented, they believe Philly organizationally knows how to win in ways that Dallas, with the specter of that 28-year, going on 29-year NFC Championship and Super Bowl berth, just hasn't. Like, the hump of overcoming, it's not just about the expectations, it's about that specter that hangs over Dallas. And I think I had someone else, everyone put him like some people put him like below Commanders and maybe it was Chargers, based off the expectations and who's in your division. Although I did have one person make clear that if they could play Washington and the Giants 2 times a year every year, they think they would also have a few more wins on their team. So yeah, people definitely had them highly ranked, and the concerns about Howie, people were not concerned. The people I talked to were not concerned about him meddling. They thought he was going to get you a good roster. And similarly with Jerry, they knew he would talk a lot, but they felt like that team has the personnel down.
I mean, and I know we're going to get into specific openings and as we get there. By the way, don't forget, C-Rob Jori writing the article Thursday, Yahoo Sports. Check it out. They'll rank all of the openings out there. I'll be checking it out to see where my beloved Raiders rank as they talk to people around the league and got a sense of how everyone ranks these openings. Let me ask you a very basic question here, though. As y'all talk, I keep feeling like there was this moment in the NBA where you could be a coach of the year one year and the next year you're just being fired and bought out by somebody. And that hasn't really, in my mind, been the NBA mindset. But we're seeing a quicker trigger than ever when it comes to some of these coaches. Like, does it not seem strange to be a year removed from Sirianni being in the Super Bowl and now questioning whether, like, how secure is his job, C-Rob? Like, that just feels like a cultural shift in the way the NFL is dealing with coaches versus 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Like, where is the grace for what you've done?
I think it depends on what's going on behind the scenes. I think it depends on what you may be letting fester. So, for example, Philadelphia, I would look at Jalen Hurts and be concerned right now because you're seeing things in his game that have existed, for the last few years. It's just they weren't accentuated, particularly last season, because you had a defense playing at its highest level. The offense was clicking there was health. There were a lot of things that went, well for Philadelphia last year. And then you look to this year, the Tampa game, he's having issues dealing with the blitz, right? And that's not new for Jalen Hurts. That has been something that's existed. It's just everything else wasn't also going wrong. And AJ Brown wasn't down for the game. And so you're sitting there and you're watching the game against Tampa and you're going, is there nothing in their back pocket to deal with this? Because it's pretty clear what they're facing defensively, and yet you don't see them altering things, to deal with it. And is that a Jalen problem? Is that a Nick Sirianni problem? Is that a Brian Johnson problem? There's something going on internally there that you need to be worried about. And to me, if you're going to make a change, it's because you see it as a flaw that can't necessarily be fixed without a head coaching change. And I think that's why you move on in a situation like that. Plus, as Jori said, what's going on with the locker room? Are they on board with this coach right now? Are they supporting him? Are they there with him? Because as she said, I covered the absolute debacle of a loss for the Cowboys. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to Dak, and immediately he puts himself in the boat with Mike McCarthy. Immediately. He's like, if there's going to be speculation about him, might as well be speculation about me, because I'm connected to that guy. And as Jori said, he said, my success is that guy's success. And that's a big deal. And to me, I'm thinking in my mind, like, okay, that Jerry's going to hear that. Like, that's definitely something.
I had people in the league tell me when Dak said that Mike was safe.
Yeah. I mean, that is absolutely.
Do we believe that? Do we believe that?
I believe it more now than I did before you said it.
Yeah, I do, but I want to come back to that because I want to finish on Philly first. So here's what I would say. In terms of grace for what someone did last year, we always hear this is a what have you done for me lately league. And lately isn't last year, it's this year. And it's not just this year, it's the end of the season. Again, Mike McCarthy and Jerry might be a different situation because the Cowboys are loyal in a way that many NFL teams are not, for better and for worse. But what I will say is if they had lost 6 games throughout the course of the regular season, maybe they won a few, then they lost one, then they won a few, then they lost one, and then they lost in the divisional round, Sirianni would have a better chance. To lose 6 of the last 7, you have people say, Troy Aikman saying on the broadcast, they just came in here looking defeated. They came in here looking like they didn't have effort. You think that clip is not going to Howie Roseman and to Jeffrey Lurie's office, and people are being like, this is what this coach is, and these players are not playing for him anymore? Like at the very end of the season, they just were not able to find anything. And then you say, okay, well, what's actually the problem? And on one hand, you have players being like, we don't know what the F problem is. Like if we knew what like we've been trying to tell you for 6 weeks and we just have made no improvement. But I think there are tangible problems under Nick Sirianni's watch that occurred on offense and defense this season. The offense being Jalen Hurts he confirmed that he felt the offense didn't have an identity. And there are people who believe that is because Nick Sirianni had one vision for it, and he's sort of like designing the scheme. Brian Johnson had his vision, he's calling the plays. And Jalen Hurts had his visions, and he's the one carrying it out. And so when those are in conflict and you don't have someone as a head coach who's able to merge rather than create the conflict, that's a problem on offense. And that is going to impact whether Jalen Hurts can continue to play at the level he played at last year. And also whether he can do it now, likely without Jason Kelce, who we're talking about the blitzes. Jason Kelce has been very helpful covering up a lot of things. Again, I saw the Cowboys go through the transition with Travis Frederick, who was a perennial Pro Bowler. And Dak got back to where he was seeing the field well, mostly, obviously not this week, but it took him some time to adjust because of what Travis had done for him. And then on the defense, they made the defensive coordinator switch in December when they were 10-3, to which, again, Troy talked about that on the broadcast and blasted them that it was an overreaction to 2 losses. And you can argue whether that was Nick's responsibility or whether that was a Howie Roseman move. I think that any decision made in Philadelphia, it's fair to consider the possibility that it may have been a Howie Roseman move given his level of power and purview. But I think that Nick took the blame for it. And again, I will actually say players have talked about, and A.J. Brown really talked about this, and he's probably been the most defensive of Nick Sirianni, how often Nick takes the blame for things that are not theirs. Like, I believe it was in Seattle at the end of that game when they weren't able to get the play, and people were like, why did Nick call that? And he gave a reason when really it was just Jalen improvising. And so it could be the same way at DC, but at some point, if the locker room believes you made that decision or that you didn't overrule that decision and it went poorly and it put the players in a bad position, it might not matter whether you made the decision because you could still lose the locker room.
All right. So with that being said, let's dial back to the Cowboys for a second because everybody's got all eyes on it. Jori, you know this locker room well from covering us. C-Rob, been around the league so long. You said you feel more confident, Charles, about the fact that McCarthy sticks around after Dak's comments. I mean, when we're sitting here a week from now, Jori, do you think that Mike McCarthy's still the head coach?
I think he is. I think that the reason you get rid of Mike is because you feel like you have a significantly better option to win in 2024. Not in 5 years, not in 3 years, in 2024. First of all, Jerry's getting older. Second of all, they have a really talented roster right now. And maybe you call that into question because if the roster is so talented, what went wrong? I think the specter hanging over them is a factor. But I think that you are not going to be able Bill Belichick might be able to get you better, but is he going to get you better? Is the offense going to be that much better if Dak's in 3 systems in 3 years? He's playing at his best league. I think that you need to find something to do, but I don't think that you are better off in 2024 in that. Now, do I think he's on the hot seat next year? And if he goes 12-5 again and is out, then after that he's done? Yes. But I don't think that Jerry will see enough of an upside to making a change, which, by the way, if you're not the Patriots hiring Jerod Mayo, you actually have to hope that the guy takes your job, not guarantee that he's going to be your successor. And so I don't think that Mike McCarthy's out. And I actually, again, on Sunday, as I was watching this, I'm like, how do you bring him back? Like, he was brought in to get them over the playoff hump. You have Mike McCarthy and the getting over the hump and the Green Bay, like those two things seem to be a really bad combination of a coach trying to fight his demons and a team trying to fight his demons, and none of them worked. And you have Dan Quinn, who I love DQ. He's one of my favorite guys in the league, but he has struggled against Shanahan's system teams for a little while now. And that's what they're going to need to overcome the playoff hump. Even so, I just don't think you can guarantee that you'll be better off if you make a switch. C-Rob, what do you think?
Look, first and foremost, when Dak said what he said, and I was sitting there, I thought, okay, that's going to ring in Jerry's ears. Like what Dak thinks of the situation, what he thinks of his head coach, and then what Dak tied his performance to this season, which, let's be real, he's probably going to end up finishing second in MVP voting, which he deserves. He had a superb season, took huge, monumental steps with CeeDee Lamb. So to me, when Dak first did that, I thought, okay, well, that's definitely going to go in Mike's favor. But let's see what happens, because in my mind, I'm thinking, I don't know who else Jerry is talking to right now. Like, is he talking to Bill? Is he talking to other people about, like, could I work with Bill? Am I weighing this? And then as this week has gone on, talking to someone under that roof, like, they straight up said, look, the guys are behind Mike, and Jerry's going to talk to some of these guys, not all of them, but there's some, especially like the leadership guys on the team. He's going to pick their brain or at least have a conversation with them. And this guy said to me, I feel like everybody's behind Mike. They're going to support him, and they're going to tell Jerry that, and Jerry's going to hear it. And he said, in my mind, what he will come down to is he will go, I let Jason Garrett coach into his last year of his deal. Why would I change the decision now, which I made then, because I wanted to see if Jason could basically take that next step up. Well, now here we are with Mike, and Mike, I think you could argue, has done better things over the course of his, span here than Jason Garrett in terms of getting Dak where he needs to be, in terms of getting CeeDee Lamb where he needs to be, in terms of the locker room really standing up for Mike to the point that his quarterback stood up there and said, put me in there with him. If you're going to, that's such a huge thing. And the other thing too, when I talked to someone in the building, he said to me, he's like, another thing, he's like, look, everybody failed in that game. It wasn't just Mike. Every single Dan did not have a good game. He said, the play calling with Mike, fine. It wasn't great. But, Dak made mistakes in that game. He said CD was frustrated. He said, go back and he said, once we watched the film, you could see how frustrated CD was. And he was doing certain things in the game that we were unaccustomed to see him doing over the course of the season, just in terms of how he was competing, with like Jair Alexander. There were times where Jair Alexander was like bullying him, and like CD wasn't really doing anything about it. And, so he said, look, it was one of those games where like everything went wrong. And as I listened to him, I thought in my mind, like they went in tight. And then once things started to slide, it got worse and worse and worse. And there was just all this, and it was interesting too, though, maybe the biggest mistake and that I might put on Mike is when they went tempo in that game, things got a lot better offensively.
They always do when they go tempo.
It's crazy.
Literally always.
The end of the first half, that drive, they go tempo. Look what happens. They take it down, they score a touchdown, right? Then the second half, they're in desperation mode at that point. Like you're behind by so much, you're like, we can't run the ball anymore. Like we just got to go for it. And next thing you know, they're rolling and they're looking confident again. You're like, maybe if they had done this going into the second quarter, just saying, hey, you know what? We're going to go 2 minute, 4 minute, whatever. We're going to basically take our tempo stuff and go. That might have changed it. So I don't know. All those different factors, I think now have played into Mike McCarthy's favor. And I still stand by, from a record perspective and from a breakthrough perspective, in terms of the standard is the standard and getting to the Super Bowl, he is not better than Jason Garrett. He's not. He's got to prove that. I think in terms of developmentally, he has been able to take Dak to a different level than where Dak was. And I think he's been able to take CeeDee Lamb to a different level than he was. And then I think he's failed with the running back position. I think the running game, there were some decisions that were made there and some functionality of how he has called plays with the running game has not necessarily worked. So in some respects, I do think he's been better than Jason Garrett in terms of just getting another level of play out of a couple of those offensive pieces that are very important.
So I want to ask, though, real quick, I'll ask both of you guys a question here. And I want to be careful in how I craft it, right? Because you guys report on things and we try not to speculate on things. So you mentioned Dak and you got more out of Dak. And every talk show in America for the last 3 days has been screaming about the future of the Cowboys. Dak is about to make $60 million and that has voidable years right there. It seems like they're in a window of decision on Dak. Have either of you seen anything that's given you any indication to believe that Dak Prescott is not going to be the long-term quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys?
Here's the thing you have to look at. First of all, I think that what C-Rob said, to sum it up, is under Mike McCarthy, the Cowboys have shown a higher floor consistently, but they need to get to the higher ceiling. And so then you ask, who is the quarterback that's going to get you? Who is the coach that's going to get you there? It's not realistic to move on from Dak if you want to this season. And again, we've talked about this. I believe it Fitz, you said this, is think about if you let this guy go, how many people are going to want him on the market? Dak led the league in touchdowns this year. He went from leading the league in interceptions to leading it in touchdowns. He had one of the best passer ratings. I will never say that. If you want to take bias and transparency in the league, I am less unbiased about Dak than any other player in the league because of the time I've worked with him, and I'm aware of that. And I think Dak would be the first to tell you, and he was the first to tell us, he said he sucked in that game. He said that. That is his words. And C-Rob was there for it. And so I think you have to still realize, though, what he did this season, there are 4 or 5 guys who you could expect to do better. And I think that goes to the question. And again, I want C-Rob to answer Dak, but to me, I want to ask you guys, how convinced are you that Bill Belichick is going to succeed in his next stop? Because I had someone tell me today for this story as we're reporting, can he win without Tom Brady? And I'm not saying he's not a fantastic coach, because I think he is one of the best defensive masterminds in NFL history, probably the best. But I think that there's a difference between, forget the personnel side. I understand that we've talked a lot about that. But I think there's a difference between the culture you set and the way you run your staff, not just your players, and what you can do from a scheme standpoint. And I am not convinced, I think it's possible, but I'm not convinced that Bill Belichick would run a better operation in Dallas than Mike McCarthy has. And I believe that. And I'm curious if you guys think that that's too harsh.
Can we just say it? The Bill Belichick thing, doesn't that feel like just a desperation? Like that whole narrative feels like it's like a desperation narrative, because when you really actually
it's when editors are desperate for content. No,
I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say that.
I won't say editors, but I will gladly say that there were many times that we would come in when I was working for the Four Letters. We would come in and be like, "What are we talking about?" And everybody's like, "I don't know. We don't have anything today." And the first thing they'd say is, "What's our Cowboys angle?" Because people pay attention to it. I will say that. Certainly say that. Go ahead, Steve.
Look, I'm just going to say here, look, the Belichick angle, it's a desperation narrative when we inject it into the Cowboys situation. And the reason why I say that is when you actually map out the individual and how he runs things versus the organization and how the owner runs things, how are you going to marry these two sides? First off, the Cowboys aren't going to give up personnel power, okay? They're going to continue to run their draft. I mean, I think they would give up free agency, but they're going to continue to run their draft the way that they want to run it, as they should. They've had a number of great picks. I mean, I think the front office there's no doubt in my mind the personnel staff is in place and good decisions are being made. So that shouldn't necessarily be given to Bill Belichick. So there's that aspect, right? Then number two, after that loss to the Packers, I'm standing outside of that locker room and I'm thinking, Jeri's coming out here and we're going to talk to Jeri. And is that how Bill Belichick wants to walk into his next job, with an owner that's going to walk out and talk after every single game? No, that's not how he's run things in the past. I don't know how you would make that work. And then what about the Tuesday radio interviews when Jerry Jones goes on the radio and makes headlines every Tuesday? And oh, by the way, Stephen Jones goes on the radio every single week and makes headlines. This is not how the Patriots are run. It's not how Bill Belichick has ever been comfortable handling things. And yet we are marrying these two things because we're saying Bill's a great coach. The Cowboys have a great roster. Let's marry the great coach and the great roster and then not think about anything else surrounding this and expect it to work. Maybe the only thing in here to me that makes me think there's even a chance that it actually happens is because Jeri coached Bill Parcells, and he has the ability to look back at that experience and go, okay, they're very similar individuals. They like to run things in a very similar manner. Here's what went wrong when I was with Bill. And here's Bill Parcells. And here's how maybe now, this is much later, obviously, in his time as an owner, this is how he would change things and negotiate a way to make Bill Belichick work. But as Jori said, there's no certainty that he's going to walk into the situation, make it any better than Mike McCarthy necessarily has. And believe me, that's not me caping for Mike McCarthy. That's just saying that this idea that Bill's going to walk in and it's just everything's the country club kind of stuff that Jori talked about happening around the Cowboys is going to disappear and then they're going to work. Well, maybe it's going to be the opposite and everybody's going to be pissed off and go, we don't want to play for this guy. This is terrible. This sucks.
I'll add one other element to this Cowboys-Belichick conversation. I talked to two guys that played in the league at the wide receiver position that both later in their career spent some time in the Josh McDaniels, Bill Belichick offense and bit of both on those offenses. And one of them, who's particularly brilliant to me, said it was like learning a foreign language I'd never heard before in my life, and I couldn't get it figured out. It was actually part of the reason that he was like, I don't think I can play anymore because I couldn't figure out the language of the offense. I would just argue that if you are the Cowboys and the thing that you have that you're banking on is your quarterback and your wide receiver and your weapons, all of these things, you are going to be bringing in. If you're bringing Belichick, you're bringing in his offense. If he's bringing Josh McDaniels with him, we'll see. I don't know. But even without Josh, his offense is wildly complicated in a much different way. So I just think it's adding an element that you don't need to add. I wouldn't expect first-year success from any quarterback in a Bill Belichick offense. I think that's asking too much from him in that process. So that's another reason I'd be out on it. Let me ask you about another big...
In some ways, that's actually kind of why I like the idea of Belichick to Atlanta, because you can say, like, Chargers, give him Justin Herbert, it's quicker to Shula's record. But maybe a place that doesn't have a quarterback, and if Josh McDaniels goes with him, which definitely seems to be the belief around the league, if they can have a year to get settled and then go get their quarterback, maybe that's better. I'm not saying it's what he wants, and I'm not saying it will be fun, but it might actually be a better recipe for success so that everyone else around can kind of understand what they're doing, and then you put a quarterback in there.
Yeah, and by the way, I still think if you're Belichick, do you really want to take on Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes every year? Do you also want to take on Sean Payton and whoever else they get a quarterback? Like, that's a stacked. Just my 2 cents. Speaking of the Chargers, Harbaugh interviewed with the Chargers. Very basic question here. C-Rob, is Harbaugh going to be coaching in the NFL this year?
I think he is, because to me, Michigan has wanted, well, at least, again, I've talked about this, the president and the Board of Regents at Michigan have wanted to do a deal with Harbaugh for a long time, and it has not gotten done. And I was paying attention to JJ McCarthy, and he ran right up against that January 15th reporting deadline. And in my mind, I was like, if he comes out, I think it's because Harbaugh's leaving. And he's obviously put himself into the draft, as have a number of underclassmen for Michigan. So I think on the Michigan side of it, you saw a lot of a huge wave of talent is leaving that championship team for the NFL, include a number of key underclassmen are going. You have the specter of the NCAA stuff hanging over his head. And, now people out here say, well, Jim Harbaugh wants some protections, basically, so that if the NCAA comes down and they go, they hit him so hard that in any other circumstance, the head coach would immediately be fired. If Harbaugh wants those kinds of protections, I don't know that Michigan can necessarily give him that, because you just don't know what's ultimately going to come out in this report. And then on top of it, I do think if Belichick doesn't end up in Atlanta, I think Harbaugh ends up in Atlanta. And that's a team that also obviously interviewed Jim Harbaugh as well. I think Arthur Blank's top two, it's Belichick and Harbaugh. Those are the two that he really wants to get one of those two, whichever fits, or if they both fit, get one of them. So, low percentage chance, 25% chance that he returns to Michigan, 75% chance that he goes to the NFL.
Yeah, I definitely have had people in the league tell me that they think Harbaugh to the Chargers is basically a done deal. Obviously, that's controversial to say. We have the Rooney Rule again. I don't know what the Patriots did, and people around there being a little bit mum on how that succession plan happened when I asked, some people who usually talk, not talking. But I do think that Harbaugh to the Chargers feels more likely than not 100%, but over 50, over 50 for him. Not just that he would be in the NFL.
Stick with that Patriots angle for a second, because you were covering Jerod Mayo's press conference. But I did think it was pretty stunning, y'all, for all the conversations we've had about Belichick and is he going to stay, is he going to go? None of us, nobody in the world seemed to know that Jerod Mayo had it built into his contract in a way the league had approved in advance that allowed them to not have to deal with the Rooney Rule at all, because the league had already approved that it was in the contract that he's the successor. A, I didn't know that could happen. B, teams around the league could look at this and say, okay, I'm going to do that for myself if I have an older, I thought it was interesting that happened, Jori. What sense did you have? You said nobody's talking about that, but did it surprise you?
Yeah, so here's the deal. I did not see this talked about a ton nationally. I didn't have familiarity with Jerod Mayo until I went to Belichick's finale, his last game in New England. I was in New England on Sunday, as people listened to the podcast last week know, at that game in the locker room after. And then I was back at the facility on Monday for Belichick's 7:30 a.m. press conference, as well as the open locker room. And pretty much everyone around there on Sunday and Monday who I talked to was like, yeah, they didn't know if Belichick was out, but they felt confident that if he was out, Mayo was in. Now, no one was talking at that point about a succession plan that the league had already approved. I think people thought he had to interview for it. I can only imagine what Mike Vrabel, who went back to New England during the season and talked about how great it was there, thought when not just another coach, but another coach who's also a tough guy, who's also a former player, who also played for the Patriots, got it instead of him and didn't even give Vrabel an opportunity to interview. But I do think that was talked about. And I think, one, give Mayo credit, that speaks to his respect around the organization. And two, Robert Kraft spoke on Wednesday, and I just think that I don't know. I just had a lot of respect for the way he's handled last week's press conference with Belichick and this week's with Mayo, and a lot of respect for Mayo. That was my first time watching him talk. I really had not had exposure to him. This was a guy who was comfortable. This was a guy who was making fun of Robert Kraft. This was a guy who was able to joke like, hey, look how big your font is for your prepared remarks compared to mine, Robert. He literally did not call him Robert, did not call him Mr. Kraft. He called him Thunder because he said he's a young Thundercat with how energetic he is. I mean, he's like making jokes with Robert Kraft left and right, but also when Robert Kraft says, so Mayo had acknowledged that he was proud of being the first black head coach of the Patriots, that he takes a lot of pride in that. And Robert Kraft said, I picked him because he's the best guy for the job. I don't see color. I'm colorblind. And Mayo said, I do see color because I think if you can't see color, you can't see racism. And it's and again, he's saying this in his opening press conference. I give him a lot of credit that like when he's talking about how he doesn't want an echo chamber and how he wants people, he doesn't want to tell people what to think, but show them how to think so that they will tell him differently. I think he displayed that in the press conference and had some credibility. And so what I will say is, while I didn't see this coming before I went to New England, I felt like it was very clear the respect that Mayo had developed based on, one, my conversations with people there, and two, seeing how comfortable he was in that intro press conference.
Let me tackle first this idea of succession, right? Like, because everybody caught everybody by surprise. And then, you hear people say, well, can you do that? Yes. And it has happened before in the NFL. The difference is, and I'll give you an example of it. When Tony Dungy was coaching the Indianapolis Colts, Jim Caldwell was his assistant, and he was named the successor in waiting. Now, they named him like a year before he actually succeeded Tony Dungy. But at the time that it happened, again, it was an organizational announcement. Everybody knew up front. And whenever Tony's ready to go, whenever he's ready to retire, Jim's going to step into that role as head coach. The wrinkle here is that I don't know how many people knew that when Jerod Mayo signed his contract extension, that he had that worked in. Who in the building was aware that Jerod Mayo was going to be the successor? It certainly was not announced until it actually happened. Now, what's also interesting about it, though, for a while, when you talk to people who were both in the organization currently and then also people who left for other jobs across the NFL, when you would talk to them about the Patriots, they all, to a person, would tell you Mayo is a very, very strong inside candidate to be the next head coach. Like, it was very well known that if there was someone in the staff that was going to be groomed into the position to take over for Bill, it was very much Mayo was the number one candidate that was talked about. So there had to be some sense internally there. There had to be, something was given off by ownership that, okay, this is who we're aiming at. This is, the person that we're leaning toward. Maybe that's because they obviously knew it's in his contract to be the successor. I think the oddity is just that we didn't know it until everything ultimately happened. And one thing, though, I will bring up, it raises some questions about the interest that the Kraft family had in Vrabel, right? Because I heard that multiple places, and I'm talking about not reporters, like in the league, they're interested in Mike Vrabel. And if Mike Vrabel comes free from the Titans, they're interested. Now, what was attached to Mayo's deal, if he did not get that head coaching job, he got a cash payout. There would be a cash settlement, right? So if they just said, hey, you know what? I know we promised the succession, it was going to go to you, but we've decided to go a different way. I don't know if they pay out what the contract would have been, or I would guess that the language in the contract says what the cash payout would have been, but he basically would have gotten a lump sum. And hey, go, you're going to go be a head coach somewhere else now.
Do you think in October, November, and December, Mike Vrabel thought that if Bill Belichick is not the head coach in New England next year, I will be?
Okay, I don't know Mike that way, right? So I don't want to speak for Mike, but
I'm not saying does he think Belichick was out? But if Belichick was out.
But Mike and Jerod have to know each other. Like, you would think, and coaches have such a tight-knit circle. You would think at some point.
No.
You would know better than me.
Hey, Fitz, how many times have you and I talked about our money? How many times have we talked about our contract? We know each other, right? I mean, like, I've known Dan Wetzel 20 years. We don't talk about that. like nobody talks about their contracts and their money in the NFL. Like, you might be best buddies,
nobody talks about their contracts, but I can tell you honestly, like, there were times at ESPN that I would hear that I was in the running for a certain show, and it'd be like, oh man, they want me to come in and do something for a show. And one of my buddies would be like, oh no, they already told me I got that. That happened behind the scenes a lot, where I'd be like, okay, Turns out, no, they're definitely. So like those conversations have happened. You're right. We don't talk about money, but like certainly I've been, and vice versa. I've had shows that I'm like, nah, man, like what I've heard is that it's going this way. Like, so that's been my experience. Very different than that.
No, I don't. I have zero confidence that Mike Vrabel and Jerod Mayo ever spoke about the Patriots job over the course of this season at all. I'm just telling you, I just don't.
No, that's true.
You would know. You would know. Yeah, I don't think that happened. And I think Mike would have been interested in the Patriots job if it had come open. Certainly, I think Mike would have interviewed for the Patriots job if it had come open. It was a surprise. You know, it was clearly a surprise. But then again, listening to Robert Kraft, what struck me about the Mayo press conference was Kraft saying, "I had this opportunity to hire Bill Belichick in 1997. I think he said 96. I think it was 97 though, but we're talking about that time frame, right? And he said he didn't do it. His gut wanted him to do it, but he couldn't do it because of Bill's loyalty to Bill Parcells. That's effectively what he said today. That stood in his way, his emotion of this guy's loyalty to Bill Parcells and Bill Parcells pissing off Robert Kraft so much that he was like, I just can't hire that guy. Then he hires him obviously in 2000 and says, geez, should have done it when I first thought this is the guy that ultimately I want to have, and I'm not going to make that mistake again. I was like, wow, okay, that's a pretty strong statement. Like he's basically saying my intuition led me to Bill Belichick, and it could have led me to him earlier, and that's exactly where I am with Jerod Mayo. I'm like, okay, that's as big as an endorsement as you can get is comparing those two situations. He's not just saying, hey, I think he's a great coach. I think he's as good as Bill. No, he's saying like in my gut when I should have hired Bill and I didn't. And he's talked about that quite a bit over the last 20, odd years about not doing it the first time around. He talked about it when he finally hired Bill in 2000 about how I should have done this a while ago. For him to invoke all of that in this press conference, I thought was a huge, just such a huge supportive statement to be made in Jerod Mayo's favor.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that we'll keep breaking it down for you because there's chaos every single week. Jori's got to leave. Look, we've held her long enough. She's going to get kicked out of the room before you know. I'm back Thursday with Zero Blitz.
Out of the room.
That's amazing. I'm back Thursday. Me, Frank Schwab, Zero Blitz. You know what we'll be doing. We'll be previewing all the playoffs. You can follow us on social media at Charles Robinson, at Jori Epstein. I'm at Jason Fitz. Stone is at SJ Rochelle for our producer behind the glass. See, Rob, tell everybody how they can continue to support Therese Paylor's legacy.
As always, check out breakingtea.com/Therese for your all juice tea or hoodie. And remember that proceeds from that purchase go to support the Therese Paylor Scholarship at Howard University. You can also support that scholarship directly as well as the one in his name at Missouri if you check out our podcast description.
I just want to give a quick shout out to our editor, Joey. I don't know if he's listening while he's on paternity leave, but there have been so many pictures and videos of Joey in his all juice team, in his Therese gear, holding his new baby Callan, and it's pretty awesome to see.
Congratulations, by the way. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Leave us that 5-star review, rate, subscribe. You guys know what to do. Tell everybody, hang out with us. We'll be back next Wednesday for more Inside Coverage. Thanks for hanging out, y'all.